It's hard to believe that John F. Kennedy would be 100 years old this year if he were alive. And other than conspiracy theories that continue to swirl around his death, it would seem no stone has been unturned in the political career of the 35th President of the United States. But two award-winning journalists have done just that with their new book, The Road to Camelot. Curtis Wilkie was a correspondent for the Boston Globe before joining the University of Mississippi as a professor of journalism. And Thomas Oliphant is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and Washington columnist for the Boston Globe. Gentlemen, it is so good to see you, and I've got to tell everybody that we have got the two surviving members of the Boys on the Bus here in the studio with us today.
Yeah, glad to be here with you.
Do you get like a shirt or anything for that? Or
It'd be the
miracle is we're alive.
Exactly. Yeah, well, you got to get your small victories. And congratulations on the book. This is fantastic. It's been getting great reviews so far. And basically it starts off with two heart attacks.
Tom?
Two big heart attacks.
Two very big heart attack, yes. Not yours, though. Yeah.
Lyndon Johnson, in 1955 summer,
right.
Lyndon Johnson's the first, kaboom. President Eisenhower, 10 weeks later, the second one, also big, down for a long time.
That's like the San Andreas Fault of politics right there.
We called it an unprecedented cardiac doubleheader.
Yeah.
One person it affected was John Kennedy's father.
Right.
Who got this crazy notion in his head that the politics of 1956 had been turned upside down. He'd somehow figure out how Lyndon could run for president. He'd bankroll it.
Of course.
And JFK would be his running mate. Johnson thought he was nuts, and I don't think spent 5 seconds thinking about it. But what we discovered is that it kindled a spark inside his son. And from that moment on, he began a conscious quest for national office that didn't stop until 5 years later when he was elected president.
So,
So
it became a 5-year odyssey, more or less. Yep. Yeah. Let's talk about the book for a second, just from the fact that you two writing it. And this came out of, I guess, an idea you had originally of doing a book about that convention where John F. Kennedy was trying to become vice president. Was
right.
that?
In '56, I was a teenager and had watched it in Corinth, Mississippi, and was struck by what a great story it was unfolding on black and white TV at that time, and never forgot it. I was casting around for a book idea, and this one came to me. I cobbled together a proposal with my agent, and no publisher wanted it. I'd conducted some interviews with some people who are now dead, who were involved with Kennedy at the time. One of the editors at Simon & Schuster who turned it down was Alice Mayhew, very famous political editor, who told me not big enough. So I discarded my hopes and dreams, and Tom will take it from there 12 or 13 years later.
You know, I showed up and we were talking.
Yeah.
And the funny thing was I'd been on a parallel track with someone who was a bit of a mentor to each of us, Ted Sorensen, who Kennedy liked to refer to as his intellectual blood bank. And Sorensen was on our case a little bit with the idea that nobody had ever really traced the origins of all this in detail, or explained how it happened. And Curtis had an insight here with his idea that's actually very important to all this, because what he saw in 1956 was all the people and some of the ideas that would dominate America for the next 15 or 20 years. Right. That it wasn't just an isolated convention, right? No. You know, that it pointed a way forward. And with the blanks that Sorensen was suggesting to me, boom.
And we went out to my office on campus at Ole Miss. Tom and his wife Susan were down visiting, and I searched for about half an hour, and damned if I didn't find this folder full of all these old interviews, research stuff. I'd already been to the Kennedy Library and collected a good bit of stuff, and so we were off and running. That was 3 years ago.
I think in reading this book, especially coming off of the 2016 election, Number one, I kind of miss the civilized nature of this time, but it really truly was the birth of modern presidential campaigns, wasn't it?
Yeah. You can make a list, start making a list of the things.
Yeah, certainly. He was really the first guy who won by approaching it through grassroots,
Voters.
ignoring the old party bosses to a large extent, or eventually becoming so powerful through his grassroots network of supporters that he was able to co-opt them. The full-time poster, Lou Harris, who helped guide them to select the states where they would go. He 30-second TV spots.
Yeah.
And it goes on and on, Tom.
Yeah, it's like you can draw. If Kennedy were alive today, I have a feeling he would get a little bit of a wry laugh out of a statement like, you can draw a straight line from Kennedy's revolution to Donald Trump. You really can't. I mean, the voters matter.
Yeah.
And you have to accept their judgment. That's part of what democracy is. And yet, it was the first modern presidential campaign. They invented this game on the fly, but for better and for worse. And similarly, I think we also found in our research that Kennedy benefited from his greatest weakness. He'd never done anything.
Yeah, that's right. He was a clean slate,
You
wasn't
talk
he?
about a blank slate. There was
Yeah.
virtually nothing on this slate except a great face, a great voice, and some promise. But instead of, learning a few sound bites the way they do today, he studied a dozen or so big questions facing the country and the world and mastered them and ended up sounding as if he were what he wasn't.
Right, which is very unusual. You don't, like you said, you don't get that much today. Here was a guy that had major health issues, and yet he had this almost unstoppable energy. I mean, that had to be a big reason why he was able to succeed.
Yeah, and of course he hid some of these health issues, and people never really knew how seriously ill he was.
Yeah.
And they denied it. They lied about it.
Addison's disease, he had
Exactly.
that. Yeah, and he had some back issues from from the war
Back
injury.
never healed.
Yeah.
We had a very helpful day with his one surviving sibling, Ambassador Jean Kennedy Smith. And she, all these decades later, can still mimic the grimace on his face when he got into a car. On the other hand, he was an 18-hour-a-day worker when he ran for Congress in '46, and he could barely walk. And when he was running for president, it was the same thing. So there were reservoirs of strength and work ethic that served him very well.
And he had a fantastic wit. I mean, some of the jokes, I think, talking about the voting for president out of the Senate.
Yes.
Yeah, that joke was quite good.
Each senator got one vote.
Exactly. Well, I remember reading Making of a President, Theodore White in college, and it was over 1 year. And after reading this, it makes a lot more sense covering the 5 years, because it really was, it kind of just showed how it evolved. It wasn't necessarily, was it a plan, or was it just kind of happened that way?
It happened, but for our plan, the last thing we wanted to do was try to emulate Teddy White, because that was probably one of the great political books of my career.
And he was right there in the middle of the campaign. He was covering it.
He was, and he later we became friends. Both of us were friends with Teddy. Had a lot of admiration for him. Great book. We didn't want to attempt to do the same thing he did. We went out of our way to avoid any of the things that he touched on, other than some stuff's unavoidable in 1960. But no question, so much of this was invented on the fly. It was spontaneous. They would have problems to surmount, and they'd figure out a way to do them. One of them, it's hard to believe today, even though I was a junior at Ole Miss when they had the election, and Catholicism was perhaps the most important issue, and I'd almost forgotten it until we began researching this book. It was an enormous issue then, and Kennedy confronted it from the beginning, and knew he had to deal with it, and he did very, very effectively. So today,
Yeah, tell how they did it, because it was like they leaked a report on that, which I thought was brilliant.
Tell this to
Yeah,
well, this was Sorensen basically did the research, and they came up with all sorts of rationales on why it was no problem to be a Catholic, that there are a lot of Catholics in some of these key industrial states, and they really provide the balance to win. And at that time, they could largely count on the South to vote Democratic anyway, because a different time.
Yeah.
We were the old solid South, the old conservative Democrats. So they created this report. Sorensen wrote it, and they gave it to a guy named John Bailey, who was a prominent Connecticut politician, who put it out, and it became known as the Bailey Report. And all sorts of journalists bought into it and spread the word.
so it was fake news before fake news
One of
became
my
popular.
favorite quotes in the whole book is we found a crack of John Bailey. He was the boss in Connecticut.
Yeah.
Found a crack from him. He said, Sorensen did all the work and I got all the credit.
That's great. That's great. The actual working on the book itself, and you know, I can imagine two people working together writing it. I mean, did you break it up by chapters? How did you come about it? And y'all basically had this giant treasure trove of research material that a lot of people really haven't tapped into yet.
One of our acknowledgments is to the 21st century.
Yeah.
We're really very grateful. And we had people who understand the 21st century who could help us deal with it. But regardless of where we were on any given day, he could look over my shoulder and I could look over his. And I mean, in past books, you know, our offices would look like the town dump. You know, there'd be stacks of papers all over the place and whatever. I don't think I ended up saving 50 pieces of paper over 2 years because of this computer stuff. It's astonishing.
And you know, we had written under double bylines at the Globe. So
you had that the whole synchronicity thing.
Yeah, we're good friends, and I'd like to think that our writing is compatible, our ideas are compatible. We never had an argument through the whole 3-year process.
We still got 15 more minutes of this interview, so we still have time. But basically, like one of you would write one chapter, and then you would send it off and look at a draft. A draft, and then you would add to
ping
it.
pong.
And go back and forth.
That works.
But with the computer, it takes, you understand this probably better than we do, but you go back and forth so fast.
Exactly.
To call it rewriting is a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, you would be doing it by FedEx or whatever back in the day, so it's much easier.
And so much so that there, I believe, 23 chapters in the book, and so therefore Tom probably had principal responsibility for 12 drafts, me for 11.
Yeah.
I could not tell you more than 3 of the chapters that I remember having primary responsibility, because that was how well I think we merged.
So it wasn't like the Federalist Papers. You didn't end up writing 75 chapters like
But
Hamilton
we like
did.
to think of ourselves as the founding fathers.
Well, exactly. Well, you interviewed them, right? So you covered the campaigns. I've got to think, though, that both of you were perfect for this because, A, you've been up in Boston, you knew the players, you covered 10 campaigns, you've covered 8. So you pretty much knew the territory. Talk a little bit about the John Kennedy Library, though, because there is a lot of material there that was invaluable.
This is really about history, Mark,
Yeah.
more than just one, because all the libraries in the system are astonishing places. But it's a reminder that history isn't a fixed point in the sky.
Yeah.
History is much more like a process. Yeah. And what we discovered at the beginning, when we were still drafting the idea, trying to figure out how you do something like this, is that there's always more. It never stops. And John Kennedy is no exception. That building that principally housed our research for a year and a half, there are 25 million pieces of paper in it. You know, some of them are worthless.
Yeah.
But in addition, more than 1,600 detailed oral histories of that time. And the surface has been scratched, but not much. As stuff is becoming available all the time. One of Kennedy's most important helpers in the campaign, Larry O'Brien. His papers only became available while we were researching.
Wow.
Never been looked at before.
I always thought Joe Kennedy was kind of the driving force behind everything. You know, some of these things are just kind of common, what you think is common knowledge. That really wasn't the case, was it?
Well, they certainly loved
money-wise,
having the money.
yeah, the money-wise, no doubt.
Yeah,
Dad's money's good.
Old Dad shelled out a lot of money, and no question they loved the old man.
Yeah.
But they disregarded virtually every idea he had. He would recommend something, and thanks, Dad, they just totally dismissed it. And it just repeatedly is one great scene, and I think at his place at Palm Beach. And it's during the primary season before West Virginia, which was shaping up to be an important primary. And he fulminates at this strategy session. You can't go there. They're all a bunch of Protestants, and this is crazy, et cetera. Don't you dare do that. And after the conclusion, Jack Kennedy stands up and says, well, we've all heard from the ambassador, and now this is what we're going to do. We're going in. And just totally dismissed him. He called Jack Kennedy an idiot. He was overseas at the 56th convention for getting involved, screamed at Bobby Kennedy, said this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. Of course, that's what burst Jack Kennedy into the national scene.
And there was a difference in perception about national politics and national leadership at that time in the mid-1950s that was very important. There is another relatively well-known quote of Joe Kennedy's from when his son was winning the Senate seat in 1952. And it's something like, you know, you're going to win this fight, Jack, and then when you win it, we're going to go on and we're going to make you president. And I know how you can do it. There are 20 people, and I'm going to get to them, and we'll do this. That notion was out of date in 1952. Yeah. And his son understood that there was a different day coming, and you had to figure out some way to empower the voters. And that was the substantive difference, and that's the key to John Kennedy's campaign.
Looking back, of course, it's your career, Curtis, and of course, you grew up here, went to Ole Miss. You were there during the riot in '62, which we covered on the other episode. But then you went to work in Clarksdale, and you covered the civil rights movement. So you had a really kind of an intimate knowledge of what Kennedy was facing. And I was really kind of surprised reading it, just how much he had to walk a tightrope.
Oh, absolutely. Because, again, we have to remember that time.
Yeah.
It was a time when African Americans couldn't vote in the South.
Yeah.
So Kennedy is counting on the white conservative Democrats to help him carry the South. At the same time, blacks were able to vote in the northern industrial states, which were key. And he, in cultivating one, he risked alienating the other. And sometimes he did it, he was very clumsy in it. He was not real comfortable in dealing with blacks. He had never had really a black friend, not even a black staff member, and he had real problems with Martin Luther King. He thought he could get Martin Luther King to endorse him. That just showed how naive he was, and he had some real fights with Roy Wilkins, who was the national president of the NAACP.
Yeah, he didn't even grow up, I guess, in a typical, Boston-type Catholic atmosphere either. He was very well. I mean, the family obviously very wealthy. He grew up in an upper class.
One prominent national liberal, Joe Rao, I think, referred to Kennedy as the first Irish Brahmin, and there's some truth in that. Though, when push came to shove, he had a capacity to learn and to evolve. His brother, too, by the way.
Right.
And it all came to a head in an episode that might have tipped the election at the very end when Dr. King was in the clink in Georgia.
Well, what was that episode?
Well, Dr. King had been arrested with others at a sit-in at Rich's department store in Atlanta, and it was a local controversy, and people thought they had worked it out and they would free them. He was supposed to be freed, and a judge in a neighboring county in DeKalb County, Georgia, somehow found an old traffic ticket and sentenced him to 4 months of hard labor, and they threw him in a notorious prison. And his wife, Coretta King, for obvious reason, feared for his life and wanted help. And she called Harris Wofford, who was one of Kennedy's people with his civil rights office, and implored him to do something to help. And they were also throwing out lines to Richard Nixon, who was afraid to touch it.
Yeah.
But Bobby Kennedy didn't want to touch it. He said it was too explosive, and we would lose the South if we got involved in this. Finally, Harris Wofford thought, who can I contact? He contacted Sarge Shriver, Jack Kennedy's brother-in-law, in Chicago. Kennedy was at a O'Hare Airport hotel and surrounded with all his Irish buddies, and Shriver knew it would be hopeless to go in and talk about it. He waited till they all left the room, and he got him alone, and he says, Mrs. King is frightened. It'd be a good idea for you to call her. And he said, well, sure, give me your number and I'll call her. And he dialed her up himself, talked to her for about 10 minutes, and boom, Dr. King's father, who really was the political mover in the family, embraced him. Blacks all over the country embraced him, and one can make a very good argument that that persuaded so many blacks in the northern states to vote for Kennedy. It made the difference in the election.
You know, it's so hard from this perspective, Mark, to realize that more than half the country was in play all the way through the general election. And there were darn near a dozen states where African Americans constituted the swing vote, and we tracked it pretty carefully. And you can see the turnout spikes in, everything from Minneapolis to St. Louis to New York to New Jersey, Detroit, that resulted from this. There wasn't a lot of national publicity, but they very skillfully reached the African American community. And for a guy who took his time coming to the civil rights movement, Kennedy could be astonishingly decisive once he got off his rear end.
Looking at just reading through the thing, there were a lot of, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of things that I thought were conventional wisdom that really turned out not to be. Name a few things that I think everybody thinks in their head, like for instance, Nixon graciously walking away from the election, because it was a very close election, obviously. Name a few things that you found that were different than what originally you may have thought.
No, Nixon didn't walk away. The Republican Party was looking very seriously at challenges in a number of states, and he gave tacit okay. It was not until a month later that he said, stop everything. Secondly, the debates.
Yes.
All right, okay. It's true. Nixon looked like he'd been sleeping on the street for a week before.
With the 5 o'clock shadow.
All of that, it's all, and Kennedy with a couple of last minute things, a blue shirt for a white shirt, a few dabs of whatever, and his voice sounded much better. No question about that. But we discovered that Lou Harris was the first guy in politics, presidential politics, to go out and poll after a debate. And he had his people in the field by dawn after each of the 4 debates. And after the first one, no question, what they found was that Kennedy was seen as more effective, more, pick your comparative. However, he also found that the horse race didn't change at all. So that, yes, Kennedy made a much better impression, but the race stayed the same.
I'll be darned, because you always, that I always learned in school that that's what threw it.
No,
was what
there's
was on
no evidence. I wouldn't.
I'll be darned.
It's not that simple.
Yeah.
Nixon, for all of his reputation post-Watergate, was really a very, very effective candidate and formidable. And he was very strong. Probably should have won on paper, he should have won that election. And he was hurt by a couple of things that we forget about. One, he banged his knee against a car door, and at the beginning of the campaign had to be hospitalized for 2 or 3 weeks. And about the same time, his president, Dwight Eisenhower, was asked at a little White House gathering with the press, Mr. President, could you tell us what Richard Nixon's done for your administration? And Eisenhower says, well, I don't know, you give me a couple of weeks and I might think of one. You know, totally demeaning.
Friends like that.
candidate.
And
Yeah.
this being the first year of short television commercials.
Yeah.
This is one example of a JFK television commercial that was on the air almost immediately and never went off all the way till Election Day. And it was apparently a very powerful spot.
I think one of the things that meant the most to me about this book was opening up the first page and seeing who it was dedicated to.
Marshall, thank you. My wife, Nancy, who died shortly after we turned in the manuscript. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and of course,
Well,
that
you
was a
know,
tough decision, wasn't it? Yeah,
I think it might have taken 2 seconds.
too. Yeah. Is there anything else about the book that you think that just kind of surprised you and you'd like people to know about?
I just had a great deal of fun
Yeah.
writing it, learning new things about him, and working with my pal, Tom.
So is there going to be a sequel?
I suggested the fall of the House of Trump. He would work with me.
My idea.
If you need a cartoonist, I've got a few
There you go.
cartoons.
No,
for that,
I was
so
thinking the Millard Fillmore Nobody Knows.
that would that would sell you at least.
Made into a musical.
You could, if you could do the musical thing, you'd be great. I heard that does well on Broadway, but you'd probably sell 12 copies of that one.
That's it. So what?
Well, congratulations and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Marshall.